Chapter 33. Ambler stole another look at Laurel and saw her right finger on what looked like a brace beneath the camera lens. In fact, he now realized the trigger. A lightning bolt of comprehension struck him with devastating force. How could he have been so blind? All along there had been a missing piece to the puzzle, hadn't there? Caston's voice, there's always got to be a fall guy. A scheme of this sort always demanded one. The realization staggered Ambler like a body blow. He was not meant to prevent the assassination. He was meant to take the blame for it. The cameras, Laurel's idea, her quote-unquote inspiration. The old models were steel-clad contraptions, and dozens of them went through the X-ray detectors every day. But the rays could not penetrate the metal. Laurel's camera didn't conceal a weapon. It was a weapon. It couldn't be, yet it was. His mind lurched and reeled. The twin-lens model was a ruse. Protruding from the top hole was the bore end of a rifle. As a piece of engineering, it was elementary. The long camera body and 2-foot zoom served as a barrel. The functioning lens could double as the sights, and the trigger, of course, was exactly where her finger was now. Indeed, she was fingering the trigger with the assurance of experience. It had to have been she who had killed Benoit Deschesnes in the Luxembourg Gardens. The Chinese marksman must have seen her do it, had seen through her deadly ruse, and recognized the true threat to his people. How slow Ambler had been to see what was before his very eyes. Yet now, with dizzying immediacy, he saw what would ensue. The shots would come from almost the precise area where Ambler was standing. Security would tackle him. His adversaries would have found that part easy to arrange. Circumstantial evidence would suggest that he was an American, but it would be impossible to prove. Nothing would connect him with any identity, because his identity had been erased. Suspicion without proof would be the most explosive thing of all. Beijing had broken out in riots when the United States accidentally bombed a Chinese embassy in Belgrade, as Ashton Palmer had noted. The loss of the beloved Luang to a suspected U.S. agent would produce an instant conflagration, and the United States could not apologize, could not acknowledge what the rest of the world would suspect, because Harrison Ambler did not exist. As I was going up the stair, I met a man who wasn't there. He wasn't there again today. I wish he'd stay away. Riots, on a scale without precedent, would overrun the People's Republic. The PLA would be forced to step in, but the sleeping giant would not return to its slumbers, not before wreaking havoc on a sleeping world. The thoughts filled his mind like a deepening shadow, yet all the while he and Laurel maintained eye contact. I know that you know that I know that you know. The childish regress came to mind now, too. Time slowed to syrup. Yes, security had no doubt already been primed to look for him. His enemies were more than capable of that. He had been wrong about so much, but right about some things as well. Luang would die. Fire would sweep a nation. The PLA would step in, cracking down, imposing the yoke of an old-style Maoist regime. But the sequence of events would not come to a halt there. Fanaticism had blinded the conspirators to the true consequences of their machinations. Once the clamor mounted and the outrage spread, the world would be plunged into war. Events of this sort could never be contained. The puppet masters never understood that. They played with fire and were consumed by it too in the end. What Ambler felt was anguish and rage and regret, twined together like strands of a steel cable. All of it, starting with his quote-unquote escape, and everything that followed, was according to plan. Their plan. Like a child in possession of a treasure map, he had been following the course laid out for him, a course that led to Davos and to death. For a moment, shock rendered him insensate, made him feel like a thing of wood and cloth, and why not? He had been nothing more than a puppet. On a small closed-circuit monitor in the bilateral room, the Chinese leader was shown speaking, captioned with an English translation. Neither Palmer nor Whitfield paid more than casual attention. It was as if, having rehearsed the event thoroughly in their heads, they found its realization was of only secondary interest. Caston flipped his cell phone shut. "Sorry, I need to pop out for a sec." He stood up shakily and started for the door. It was locked from the inside. Impossible. Now Ellen Whitfield flipped off her own cell phone. "I'm sorry," she said. "Given the delicacy of our conversation, I just thought it would be best if we weren't disturbed. You'd been worrying about our precautions. As I've been explaining, they're far more extensive than you seem to have realized." "I see." Caston felt winded. Her mouth formed a small M-O-U-E. I don't know what that word means. "Mr. Caston, you worry too much. What we've arranged is a tidy little bank shot, strategically speaking. Luang is assassinated. The U.S. government inevitably is suspected, and yet plausible deniability is maintained. Because, after all, the assassin doesn't exist." Palmer's expression remained self-amused. "You're talking about Tarquin." Caston watched him carefully as he said the name. "You're talking about Harrison Ambler." "Harrison who?" Whitfield asked slightly. The auditor stared straight ahead. "You programmed him." "Someone had to." There was no trace of self-doubt in Whitfield's dark blue eyes. "Let's give the man his due, though. He's done a magnificent job. We'd set a difficult course for him. Few could have navigated it, though we did think it prudent to give him a heads-up about the concept's sanction. I'd asked our principal to commission Tarquin to take out one Harrison Ambler. I'm almost sorry I wasn't around for that conversation, but that's a detail." "How'd you set Ambler up, then?" Caston asked, his voice neutral. "That's the beauty part," Ashton Palmer said sagely. "So to speak. Es neigen die Weißen oft Ande zu schönem Sich, as Holderlin once wrote. And in the end, the wise often succumb to the beautiful." Caston tilted his head. "I've seen the payment records," he bluffed, "but they don't tell me how you found her. Laurel Holland." Whitfield's countenance remained sunny. "Yes, that's how Tarquin knows her. And she really played her part to perfection. She's a true prodigy, Lorna Sanderson is. I suppose you could say it was really a matter of matching one extraordinary talent with another reciprocal one. As you probably know, there isn't a person in 10,000 who could fool a man like Harrison Ambler." Caston's eyes narrowed. "But Lorna Sanderson is 1 in a million. You got it. A hugely talented actress. Won the top drama prizes in college. She was a star protege of a disciple of Stanislavski, who said he'd never seen such raw talent." "Stanislavski?" "Legendary acting coach, devised the concept of the method. Method actors train themselves to experience the very emotions they're projecting. That way they're not, in a sense, really acting. Quite a skill if you can master it, and she did. She was extremely well-trained, extremely promising. Right after she left Juilliard, she played the lead in an off-Broadway production of Hedda Gabler. Got raves for her performance. Truth is, if she'd caught the right break, she could have been another Meryl Streep." "So what happened? And what was happening outside the door?" As sturdy as it was, Caston was seated close enough to it that he could detect the vibrations of some sort of, scuffle. Unfortunately for her, she had a problem. Lorna was a junkie. Speed, then heroin. Then she started to deal, mainly to be sure of having a steady supply for her own use. When she was arrested, her life was effectively over. New York has those Rockefeller drug laws, of course. Sell 2 ounces of heroin and it's a Class A felony, a sentence of 15 to life, and 15's the minimum. That's where we stepped in, because a talent like that doesn't come along every day. Through a PSU liaison officer, we had a federal prosecutor broker a deal with the local DA's office. After that, we owned her. She was a special project of ours, and she proved an awfully apt pupil, really grasped the vision. And so everything has unfolded according to plan, Caston said heavily. His eyes darted from one to the other, 2 infuriatingly smug faces, one shared vision. Madness. What frightened him most, he realized, was how unfrightened they were. Abruptly, the door burst open. A burly, barrel-chested man loomed in the doorframe. Others were crowded immediately behind him. Caston turned and looked at the man. "Don't you ever knock?" "Evening, Clay." His hands on his hips, the ADDI stared at Whitfield and Palmer, with recognition but without surprise. "Wondering how I figured out what you were up to?" he asked the auditor. "What I'm actually wondering, Cal," said Caston mirthlessly, "is what side you're on." Norris nodded gravely. "I guess you're about to find out." Time and space, the here and now, all seemed transformed to Ambler. The Congress Hall felt as airless and as cold as outer space, and time ticked by in slow, thudding seconds, keeping rhythm with his own pumping heart. Harrison Ambler. How hard he had worked to reclaim that name, a name that would soon be nothing other than a byword for infamy. He felt sickened, battered by nausea and self-disgust, and still he would not stand down. She must have seen that in him, for while eye contact between them remained unbroken, he detected, saw or sensed, the faintest movement, some muscle contraction preparatory to the squeezing of a trigger, or perhaps he simply knew it without seeing or sensing at all. Because for just that split second, he was she and she was he, the two sharing an instant of transparency that was an instant of identity, a connection no longer of love, but of loathing, and Ambler threw himself at her before he realized what he had done, threw himself at her at the very moment she squeezed the trigger. The weapon's loud report pulled him back into himself. An explosion overhead, a microsecond later, a popping noise, the shattering of brilliant, tiny fragments of glass, a faint but perceptible diminishment of illumination, told him that the bullet had gone awry, had struck one of the tank lamps racked at the ceiling. Even as that thought sunk in, he felt a searing pain at his midriff, felt the pain even before he registered the flashing motion of her hand, the shiny seal of the blade it held. Some part of his mind reeled, baffled. It made no sense. It took another split second before he realized that she was stabbing him now for a second time, that she had slashed at him first unseen, was slashing at him, yes, slashing and plunging, again and again, penetrating him in a spasmodic frenzy. Blood poured from him like wine from an overfilled goblet, and none of it mattered, for he had to stop her or he would lose everything. His name, his soul, his being. With all his remaining strength, he lunged at her, even as the long blade plunged once more into his entrails. His hands formed grappling hooks that rested her arms up and to her sides, pinning them to the floor. The screams and shrieks around him sounded as if they were coming from miles away. He was conscious of nothing other than her, the woman he had loved, the killer he had never known at all, thrashing and struggling beneath him, a grotesque parody of love-making that was fueled by the opposite of love. Her face, inches from his, showed nothing other than fury and the pure vicious determination of a jungle predator. The loss of blood began to cloud his mind, even as he relied on his own body weight to supplement his ebbing strength and prevent her escape. A distant voice emerging from the hiss of white noise like an AM radio station, bounced by sunspots from another continent. Recall the man of ancient times who set up shop in a village, selling both a spear he said would penetrate anything, and a shield he claimed nothing could penetrate. The spear, the shield. A man who saw through everybody. A woman whom nobody could see through. The spear, the shield. Fragments of time flashed through his head, dimly, as through a malfunctioning slide projector. In Parish Island, the quietly murmured words of encouragement. It was she who had planted the notion of his escaping in the first place. Even the exact date, he realized that now. It was Laurel who, at every juncture, had kept him both off balance and on track. Tarquin, the Menschenkenner, had met his match. It was Laurel all along. The realization pierced and transfixed him, opened a wound more painful than those she had inflicted with her blade. He closed his eyes briefly, and then opened them, and the opening of them felt as arduous as any physical task he had ever done. He peered into her eyes, searching out the woman he had thought he knew. Before he lost consciousness, he saw only blackness and defeat and a snarling antagonism. And then in that blackness, faintly, flickeringly reflected, he saw himself.